We know that members of the militia groups that were present on January 6th have stated their desires that they want to blow up the Capitol and kill as many members as possible with a direct nexus to the State of the Union.
A terrifying warning from the acting Capitol Hill police chief as charges against those involved in the deadly riot continue to pile up. Among those involved, an alarming number of current and former military and law enforcement officials. A retired NYPD cop and an ex-Marine, Thomas Webster, surrendered to the FBI earlier this week and faces 6 counts related to the attack after this video showed him assaulting Capitol officers and leading a stampede. In this week's installment of In the Spotlight, we're taking a look at MSNBC contributor Jason Johnson's new podcast, A Word with Jason Johnson. His very first episode dives into how the insurrection illuminated ties between violent white nationalists and U.S. law enforcement. Take a listen.
What is it about white supremacy and white nationalism that is so attractive to these mediocre white guys? Is it because it makes them feel tough for once? Is it because they think they're going to be Luke Skywalker in their own fantasy film and they're going to be the next Steve Rogers Captain America? Or is it they're just mad because they're mediocre white guys and they see a world that's increasingly having to be shared with different kinds of people?
Yes, all of the above. If you look at the fighters on the Capitol, the people who stormed the Capitol, these young men are all literally dressing up like special forces soldiers. To these people, the Boogaloo Boys think that they're Joint Special Operations Command.
Exactly.
It's so true. Talking about kind of the makeup that you saw on the Capitol Hill steps as I was there reporting, so many of them were dressed up that way. Here with me now, actually, is Jason Johnson, MSNBC political contributor and host of A Word with Jason Johnson. Jason, I listened to this podcast earlier today as I was on my run. It's so good, by the way. Congratulations on having it be out first time yesterday. Really good job. Let's talk about that a little bit more. Per the kind of recruiting that's happening overall, and the encouragement in that it seems as if so many of these white nationalists and white supremacist groups are encouraging their followers to go get military and law enforcement experience.
Yeah, that's one of the main things that Malcolm Nance and I, who's also an MSNBC contributor, talked about. It's this idea that, you know, first they're radicalized online. They're reached out to through video games, or they just go to particular websites and people are telling them, hey, go become a cop, go join the military. First off, you know, you might get sent overseas where you get to shoot brown people, but you'll get the kind of training that you need to come back and fight people here. And one of the really dangerous things that we talk about in the podcast, A Word with Slate, is that these men are oftentimes unsuccessful in other parts of their lives. They're a bunch of George Zimmermans, basically. They're Paul Blart Mall Cop kind of guys. They want to feel tough. And so joining these movements where they can go and brandish guns and dress up like superheroes and engage in this kind of violence, it empowers them in a way. So it's not just an issue of calling this violence out. It's going to the places where they're being recruited and saying, hey, look, you got to purge these people before they become a larger army than they are now.
Well, and you guys talked about this really well, in that many of them were trusted on January 6th to not do what they ended up doing because of the color of their skin, because they were white.
Yeah. They look, much of what we saw, and I put this contrast in because Republicans talk about this often. They talk about, well, we had Black Lives Matter riots last summer, and that's, you know, no different than this. No, what you saw last summer prior to protests for Black Lives Matter, which were incredibly multicultural, is you saw dozens of state capitals across the country being attacked by mobs of mostly angry white people screaming about mask mandates. So these guys had already seen, oh, you know what? If we engage in violence, if we push the limits here, if we try and break down and get into the Capitol and threaten to hang Mike Pence, we're probably not going to face any real consequences. And what America needs to understand is that if these groups are not taken out, you can't stop anybody for having any ideology that you want, but you can stop people from engaging in violence. If we don't do this, then our country is in the beginning of a slow-moving insurrection that one day will be a successful coup, and they will all be looking back on times like this and saying, hey, why weren't we more aggressive about knocking somebody out of the police force who expresses racist terminology or belief system? Why weren't we more careful about getting people out of the military that had white nationalist tattoos and 3% markings on their bodies before we sent them off to Iraq?
It's also really interesting because some of the folks that I spoke to, one of which was a former law enforcement individual who identified himself as part of a militia, they feel as if they're back in this kind of constitutionalist era, right? Like they're defending their country, their homeland, their house. You know, I should basically be armed with a gun because the government is coming after me, and that's why we're here. It's just incredible to see. And also in your podcast, you and Malcolm talk about the racism that Malcolm felt inside of the military, which I thought was astounding to hear. So your podcast is great, Jason, and I want to encourage everybody to go and take a listen to it. Jason Johnson, thank you so much. Congratulations. I'm sure so much more good stuff to come. By the way, you can tune in and subscribe to the brand new A Word with Jason Johnson podcast wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes are out every Friday.